Yeah, hi, Dr. Anna Lembke. Welcome to my show. Thank you for doing this because you've been very busy on the speaking rounds, getting a tremendous reaction to your studies and to your new book and to this whole area of addiction. Now, we know addictions are on the rise in the West, in the US, but the way you described it puts it in starker terms than I thought was possible. So can you take us through that and tell us where we're at?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that when we look at the public health problems that are going to be most pressing in the next 100 to 500 years, I do think that addiction will make the top five of that list. And the reason for that is essentially that we've reached a tipping point in terms of our social, economic, cultural development, such that we are we ourselves have created a world for which our primitive brains are not well adapted. And until we individually and collectively figure out how to bridge the gap between our primitive brains and the world we've created, it's going to be a real challenge.
So how did we get to this point today? You talk about the prosperity in the West, the rise of digital media, the rise of pleasure seeking, and we're in a crazy place, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most significant factors is just the incredible technological innovation, beginning 250 years ago with the Industrial Revolution, which has allowed for a number of different developments. Number one, it's allowed for us to have much more leisure time than ever before in the history of humankind across the board, not just for wealthy people, but also for poor people, such that not only do we have more time on any given day. For example, we average now about 4 hours of leisure time a day in the West. By 2040, the prediction is that we will have on average 7 to 8 hours of leisure time a day. That's a tremendous amount of leisure time. We also are living longer than ever before. So, on average, for most of human existence, people died at age 30. Now they're living on average to age 80, 90. So not only do we have more time on any given day, we have more days, and yet we haven't yet figured out what to do with that additional time. The reason for those additional days and additional leisure time is essentially technology, which has created machines that do much of our work for us, that efficiently manufacture food more than we need in most places of the world today. And also, of course, technology has created the kinds of medical interventions that prevent people from dying young. So technology has allowed for more time. At the same time, technology has allowed for an incredible innovation in the quantity, access, potency, and novelty of highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, which makes a big difference when we think about addiction risk. Because the more of a drug we have access to and the more potent that drug, the more likely we are to get addicted to that drug. So we've essentially created a drugified world, and we have much more time in which to pursue that as a leisure activity. And I think the result is clearly, has some serious consequences. If you look at the leading cause of deaths around the world, 70% of global deaths today are due to modifiable risk factors, including poor diet, inactivity, and smoking.
Well, you wrote about all of this in Dopamine Nation. That's been out a while now. So sort of take us through that. But before you do that, just give us some of these staggering statistics, if you will, that kind of gives us an idea how serious the addiction problem is in the West.
Sure. So again, there's the global health problem, which essentially suggests that we are titillating ourselves to death. If you look just at alcohol use disorder, we've seen an 80% increase in women with alcohol use disorder in the past 2 decades. We've seen a 50% increase in alcohol use disorder among older people. That's very significant because these are demographics that previously were thought to be insulated from the problem of addiction. We're seeing more global deaths in all age categories from addiction, and half of those deaths are in people under the age of 50. And then, of course, in the United States, we have this devastating opioid epidemic where we have 90,000 plus drug overdose deaths in any given year. And the majority of those deaths are attributable to opioids.
Yeah, and I'm sure during the height of the COVID pandemic, there was a tremendous surge in abuse because of social isolation and other factors.
You're absolutely right. It's very tragic because opioid overdose deaths and drug overdose deaths have been steadily increasing in the United States since the late 1990s. Drug overdose deaths quadrupled between 1999 and 2012, and then plateaued, but continued to rise, especially with the introduction of illicit fentanyl in 2013, 2014. We saw a little ray of light around 2018, where for the first time, drug overdose deaths decreased slightly in this country, but then once COVID hit, they went up again. So it's been a real and ongoing tragedy.
Yeah, that's so sad. It really is. So, when the lawmakers asked us to socially isolate, that kind of cured the pandemic on one level, but then we had all this social isolation created another set of psychological problems.
Oh, absolutely, especially for people living alone. I will say that in my own clinical practice, COVID and quarantine had two divergent aspects. I had some patients for whom it was much easier to be in recovery from their addiction during quarantine because they weren't constantly being triggered by going out into society. So for some people, quarantine was really a positive, but clearly I also had patients for whom it was devastating. I had patients who died, several patients who sadly drug overdosed during quarantine and during COVID. So
that is absolutely stunning and shocking. We probably would have guessed that, but to hear it is something, it brings it home. Tell us about your book. That's got a tremendous reaction from the general public and I suppose the medical professionals out there.
Yeah, so I'm surprised, right? The message of the book is that essentially that the relentless pursuit of pleasure for its own sake ultimately leads to anhedonia, or the inability to take pleasure in anything. And I talk about the neuroscience and why that is, why the pursuit of pleasure leads to pain. And ultimately, I hold out for the reading public the idea that we need to eschew or reject pleasure for its own sake and embrace painful activities. And so that's not a message that I thought would be particularly popular with the average reader, but of course it's been very gratifying to see that it has resonated.
Well, you in an opinion piece that you wrote spoke about a patient you had once came into your clinic and he was addicted to video games.
That's right.
And you in the past might have recommended an antidepressant, but in this instance, you told him to go on a fast from his video games. It seemed to have worked.
Yes, that's right. And that's first of all, let me say that every patient that I've written about in detail has given me their consent to do so,
okay.
As did this young man. And you're absolutely right. My practice has really shifted in the last 25 years. This young man came in with anxiety and depression. His parents felt he was addicted to video games. He did not agree. In his mind, the video games were a relief or an escape from his anxiety. 20 years ago, had I seen this young man in my practice, the first thing I would have done was prescribe an antidepressant. Today, the first thing I do with a patient like this, and I see many patients like this with similar problems, I recommend a dopamine fast, which is to say I suggest that they abstain from their drug of choice, whether it's video games or alcohol or cannabis or social media or what have you, for 30 days. And I explained to them my reasoning behind that, which is essentially that what feels to them like the video game is relieving their anxiety and depression, is actually driving the anxiety and depression. And once we understand the neuroscience of pleasure and pain, that becomes very clear why that is. And when I do this intervention and I explain the neuroscience, patients are willing to give it a try, many of them, and about 80% of them will come back after a month of fasting from their drug of choice and report significant improvements in mood and anxiety just by fasting alone without any other intervention.
Wow, that's amazing. But I gotta believe that that's tough for some patients, especially if they're, cocaine users or alcohol abusers. I mean, going cold turkey, do they break into sweats every night or during the day? Can they get through the 30 days fasting without some serious pain?
So it's a great point. Let me just emphasize that addiction is a spectrum disorder from mild, moderate to severe. And even before mild, there's sort of compulsive overconsumption, which all of us can relate to, which doesn't necessarily meet threshold criteria for addiction. And yes, you're absolutely right that, giving up our drug of choice, no matter where we are on the addiction spectrum, is very painful. The universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance include anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And then beyond that, many drugs have a significant physiological withdrawal syndrome, including nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, body pain. So it is very painful. Some patients cannot do it on their own and need to go into a residential treatment setting in order to be able to do that. Some patients shouldn't do it on their own because in some cases, withdrawal can be life-threatening, and those people need to go into a hospital and be medically supervised. But I will say that the vast majority of patients on the addiction spectrum are able to safely give up their drug of choice for a month. And yes, it is painful, but when they are able to do it, the benefits multiply the longer that they can go. And so it really does start with abstinence, because abstinence is necessary and is fundamental to resetting reward pathways so that people can stop constantly craving and also enjoy other more modest rewards and re-engage in their lives in a healthy way.
You look at society today, and you described it. We're bombarded with pleasure-seeking opportunities, digital media, increasing wealth, however you measure that, entertainment industry, and now we have individual states pushing legalized marijuana.
That's right. That's right. Not just legalized, but also medicalized. This idea that it's even safe to use because it's medicine. And of course, cannabis does have over 400 different ingredients in it, some of which do have real health benefits in the short term. The problem is that smoking anything is bad for you, and the adverse effects of smoking probably outweigh the short-term medicinal benefits of the molecules that are active in cannabis. But the standard cultural narrative is that it's medicine. So many people either are not aware of the potential adverse effects or think that the medicinal properties outweigh the harms. And this is, really problematic. For example, in this country with the opioid epidemic, there was some early data suggesting that in states where medical marijuana or medicinal cannabis was more readily available, that opioid overdose rates were decreasing. The idea being that if people could transition from opioids to treat their pain to cannabis to treat their pain, they would be less likely to overdose. It is true that it's very difficult to overdose and die from cannabis. So that is a benefit that it has over opioids. But the problem is that in terms of pain treatment, there's no reliable evidence that it works long-term for pain. It works short-term for pain, but again, our bodies will adapt. It will stop working. And now the data show, and this is consistent with my clinical experience, that most patients dependent on opioids for their pain who have tried to transition to cannabis and away from opioids end up on both opioids and cannabis with no benefit at all.
So sort of a gateway drug too there.
Right. And again, just this narrative that it's medicine, and so somehow it's safe or it's not addictive, and those things are not true.
How much of what we're seeing in addictions is some kind of a spiritual deficit in our society, a religious deficit, if you will? I mean, as less people have religious belief, go to church, for example, they seek fulfillment or answers elsewhere. Have you looked at that?
Yeah, I think this is a really, powerful point. And I think that this is true for many people who become addicted. Carl Jung, the very famous psychoanalyst, very early on, wrote a letter in which he said that he believed that at the root cause of addiction was the absence of spirituality or the absence of God in that person's life. Alcoholics Anonymous is essentially founded on this idea that in order to get into recovery, the individual needs to experience a spiritual transformation and a shift of that locus of control away from themselves and towards some higher power. The genius of AA is that AA defined that higher power however that individual wanted to define it. It didn't need to be an anthropomorphized personal God. It could be, the mystery of the universe, the goodwill of the fellowship itself. Since then, there have been a number of wonderful books written along these lines as well. This idea that, that severe addiction is really a kind of a counterfeit worship. I'll never forget when a colleague of mine, an economist who studies the behavioral economics of religion, said that he'll never forget seeing a friend of his very addicted to heroin bowed down on his knees, shooting up, and how he was reminded in that moment how visually he looked as if he was a person in prayer or in worship. And that image will always stay with me.
It's kind of haunting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sad and distressing. And there's so much sadness and distress associated with addiction. And it's great that you're at the forefront of really interesting research. So to kind of get our arms around it, dopamine is what's at play here, correct? So if you've too much, too little, or you need a constant fix, there has to be a balance.
That's right. Dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in the pathophysiology of addiction, but it's probably the most important one. And it's also the final common pathway for all addictive substances and behaviors. And the sort of key message in the book is that pain and pleasure are co-located in the brain, which is to say the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. And that one of the overriding features of that balance between pleasure and pain is that the brain wants to preserve homeostasis or a level balance, and it will work very hard to do that. So when we do something when we ingest an intoxicant or engage in a behavior that's intoxicating, it releases a whole lot of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, more really than our primitive brains were designed to accommodate. And in response, what our brains do is downregulate our own dopamine production and transmission as a way to restore a level balance or restore homeostasis.
So
but the key,
go ahead.
I was just going to say the key feature, though, is that we don't just sort of like deplete dopamine to baseline levels. We actually plunge below baseline levels so that we're in a dopamine deficit state. This is the hangover or the come down. But with persistent bombardment of our dopamine reward pathways with these intoxicating behaviors and substances, essentially our brain has to accommodate that through what's called allostasis by getting into a chronic dopamine deficit state. And that means that we get to the point where nothing else is pleasurable. We're very narrowly focused on our drug of choice. When we're not using, we're in a constant state of withdrawal, experiencing anxiety, depression, insomnia, craving. And now we need to keep using, not to get high, but just to feel normal.
So you could have that state with abusing alcohol, abusing digital media, You could be binge purchasing, overeating, all those kind of things. You yourself had an addiction.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I developed a minor addiction to romance novels. I started with the Twilight Saga, which was very transportive for me, in my sort of early 40s. And it was just sort of, I forgot about myself. I escaped into this fantasy world. For whatever reason, I had never read romance novels previously. I hadn't discovered them as a younger person. And that sort of sent me on this journey of reading more and more romance novels. Eventually, over time, I needed more potent forms, more graphic erotica to get the same effect, and ultimately found myself, having consequences, which is, the sort of sine qua non of addiction is continued compulsive use despite harm to self and or others. And I was staying up late at night, tired the next day. Importantly, no longer taking pleasure in things that used to give me pleasure, like being with my family, like my work. And suddenly, really realized that I had developed this minor behavioral addiction and did what I recommend to my patients, which was to give up my drug of choice for a month with the plan that I would then go back into reading in more moderation. But what happened was, after a month of abstinence, I actually binged for a whole weekend, spent the whole weekend reading romance novels, and then really realized, wow, I don't think I can even moderate this behavior. Something has changed in my brain. And that's when I decided to give it up essentially permanently, which I've done with some, occasional forays into it. But, in essence, I don't even enjoy romance novels anymore. It's like I've burned out those circuits. And a lot of my patients will describe that as well, that when they do try to go back to using their drug of choice after many years of using it, that it doesn't even work for them anymore.
So you got over your addiction. When people give up their addiction, let's say to alcohol, in some cases they develop an addiction for something else. We've seen examples of that. They suddenly become crazy purchasers of automobiles, or go on eating binges. So they're not really cured.
Well, you're right. I mean, the problem of cross addiction is very pervasive. It's one of the things that, I warn my patients about. When they give up their drug of choice, I say, watch out for cross addiction, switching to some other drug or behavior in order to kind of feed this sort of addiction cycle. Yeah, I mean, it's something to think about. I think it's important to emphasize, though, that not everybody's equally vulnerable to the problem of addiction. About 10 to 15% of the population has this sort of innate vulnerability, and that's the group that especially has to work on this problem of cross addiction. Most of us who develop these minor addictions will be able to give up our drug of choice and not translate that behavior to something else. But you're absolutely right. Those with, really with this sort of innate propensity to become addicted, what used to be called the addictive personality, which is not language that we're using today, but it's not a bad sort of summative nomenclature. Those individuals really do have to struggle, because many of them are just people who need that kind of intensity. So the challenge then becomes how to find that intensity in healthy and adaptive ways.
So there's a lot of really good success stories. We want to be optimistic here.
Yes. Very important to be optimistic. Lots of people, even with very severe addictions, get into long-term, decades-long recovery, have incredible, meaningful lives. Our repositories of amazing wisdom, as I talk about in my book, my patients in recovery are my heroes. And I do think they're modern day prophets for the rest of us for how to live in this dopamine overloaded world.
Well, many of them go on to speak about it, to contribute to the world in a very meaningful way, and do brilliant things.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's absolutely right.
Post-addiction and recovery, is there any other tools they can use to get through those tough times where they may feel drawn back into their earlier addiction? Do you recommend meditation, lots of exercise, reading healthy books, community involvement? Are there any kind of things like that to get them through those maybe sometimes dark moments?
Yeah, I mean, all of those things that you just listed, conceptually in the book, I do talk about this pleasure-pain balance and how repeatedly pressing on the pleasure side ultimately tips our hedonic or joy set point to the pain side. And so one of the things that I do recommend in the book is to actually lean into pain, to do things that are painful and challenging as a way to shift our hedonic set point to the pleasure side. And that includes physical painful activities like exercise or ice cold water baths or other physically challenging endeavors. Importantly, not extreme forms of pain. Extreme forms of pain or pain in very large quantities essentially becomes a drug and has the same sorts of effects on the dopamine reward pathways as something like cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin. So that's not the recommendation. It's more mild to moderate doses. And then also, psychologically challenging endeavors. For example, doing something that's cognitively challenging or something that's, creatively challenging, or even just kind of thought experiments like radical truth telling. One of the things I've learned from my patients over the years is that telling the truth about things large and small is fundamental to staying in recovery. And it's very challenging to do that because we're all natural liars. So making a commitment to going through your entire day without telling a single lie is something that I prescribe to my patients and that I believe is beneficial for a variety of reasons for maintaining recovery. And then also I talk about the importance of pro-social shame. And again, this is a way of leaning into pain instead of pleasure as a way to get into and maintain recovery. And what I mean by pro-social shame is that we are all social creatures and that shame is really a fundamental emotion in order to be able to maintain the cohesiveness of the tribe that we belong to. And although shame can be devastating and contribute to the cycle of addiction, it also can be the source of motivation for behavior change. So when we embrace pro-social shame, we acknowledge the ways in which we have harmed others. We try to make amends for the harm we've done. And we try to use that, the pro-social shame and wanting to not experience shame in the future as a source of motivation to get into and maintain recovery. So as you say, the connection with other humans, that's, we talk about that often in vague terms, it's good to be connected to other people. Well, how do we make those connections? How do we maintain those connections? I would argue that two of the fundamental ways to do that is radical honesty, where we're completely honest, especially with intimate partners. And number two, pro-social shame, where we regularly look for the ways in which we can, better ourselves by acknowledging where we've gone wrong.
So community, family, and humility.
That's right. Humility is so fundamental to recovery. And one of the sort of hallmarks of people in sustained recovery, which is why they are my heroes, is just the incredible humility that they bring to their lives. Because, how in many cases, how could they not? The kinds of, sort of devastating harm wrought by their own behavior, that they have to embrace their brokenness and their humility. And that takes a tremendous amount of courage.
It's got to be tough. I mean, so, some of these people were dealing with their maybe self-esteem, their pride, and so on. So humility, not so easy to put it into practice. When you look at the West today, you talked about soaring rates of addiction. I mean, obviously that worries the experts and people who care about the world, but do we risk some kind of societal collapse if we don't get a handle on this very soon?
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. This isn't just a problem of individuals. What's at stake here really is, our societies and also our planet. Our compulsive overconsumption threatens to deplete our natural resources, our forests, fisheries, fuel sources. Also importantly, this kind of compulsive overconsumption threatens to make us all addicted persons of a sort, in that when people are in their addiction, they value short-term rewards over longer-term rewards. And we know this from all different types of studies. For example, functional imaging studies show that when adults are engaging in an activity that involves short-term rewards, the parts of their brain that lights up is the emotion parts of their brain, the reward pathway part of the brain. Whereas when they're engaging in longer-term delayed rewards, they get the prefrontal cortex lighting up. The prefrontal cortex is that gray matter part of our brain right behind our foreheads that's essential for delayed gratification, for future planning, for sorting out consequences of complex problems. So my worry is that we're all so instantaneously gratified in so many ways, not just in terms of substances and recreational behaviors, but even in terms of, like, if we have a question that we need an answer to, we don't have to wait anymore or puzzle it out. We just Google it. And so there is this way also in which social media kind of encourages this herd mentality. And by the way, when we experience an emotion at the same time as somebody else, that's also reinforcing and releases a lot of dopamine, which can contribute to this idea that, collectively the herd is making good decisions when it's really not. It's just being driven by the reinforcing properties of dopamine release. So I do really worry that sort of by living in our limbic or emotion brain and be constantly reinforcing or gratifying, pretty much everything, we've lost the knack for delayed gratification, for frustration tolerance, for uncertainty, for nuance, for complex problem solving.
You look at earlier generations, our forefathers and foremothers, and the way they dealt with these issues, which kind of leads me on to another area. There are groups out there, churches, non-religious groups have all these interesting ideas about fasting. And you look at, for example, the Catholic Church and Christian churches, they have the season of Lent,
right,
where they say, hey guys, give up something, give up the cigarettes, give up watching TV, give up your pleasure. So there must have been some early wisdom there.
Absolutely. I love that. You're right. That sort of recommendation repeats itself throughout human history, this idea of abstinence, a period of abstinence, a period of giving up. What I think is so fascinating is how we have had that innate wisdom for thousands of years, and now we have the neuroscience to show why it works. And that's just something that just generally has always appealed to me, the ways in which inside us there is a knowing of what is right and good and that we should be doing. And then much, much later, we discover the science to show what's actually going on. But we don't need the science necessarily, to know what's right.
So you said earlier about when this client came, and in an earlier time you would have recommended antidepressants, but you told him to go on a fast. So do you still use medications in your practice, or are you now more of a balance between fasting and some medications?
I use medications. I absolutely use medications, because some people will do the dopamine fast and not come back feeling any better than when they started. And those are individuals who clearly have a co-occurring psychiatric disorder. And oftentimes some patients will come back and they will initially feel better from the dopamine fast, but as they continue to abstain, they might then develop, more depression or more anxiety, even in the absence of that, using that drug of choice. And then I will often use medications. So the message here is not to get rid of medications. The message is really to recognize that we need to both change our behavior and protect ourselves from too much dopamine, at the same time that we need to make sure we pay attention to co-occurring psychiatric disorders and integrate their treatment with the behavioral interventions.
Well, on that very interesting note, Dr. Anna Lembke, thank you for being on my show, and good luck with your research and the book. Fascinating read.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
You were listening to Dig Life Deep with John Aidan Byrne. You can reach the host in the U.S. at 973-529-4699. That's 973-529-4699. 973-529-4699. Email byrnedesk@gmail.com. That's byrnedesk, B-Y-R-N-E, desk@gmail.com. byrnedesk@gmail.com. Subscribe for free.